Chapter 2. Wild Horses. Ace wandered away from the library, thinking about sex and death. She glanced up at the doctor, deep in thought. He wasn't really into either, she figured. If he died, he'd just regenerate, and although he sometimes let things slip about a family, he never seemed to fancy anybody. Which was because he wasn't human, let's face it, but she was, and she was starting to shiver both ways this cold morning. Poor Julian, in his grave now for 5 centuries. At least he was warm. A baby broke from its mother, and dashed across the muddy street into Ace's legs, falling over. It looked up at her, surprised, and opened its mouth to howl. So Ace picked it up before it did. He, glared up at the new face, the frown wrinkling every line on his forehead. "You're lucky, mate," Ace told the little boy. "You've got years before you need to start worrying." The doctor leaned over the baby and grinned at it. The baby grinned back. A laughing mother in a linen tricorn reached into Ace's arms and retrieved her child. They exchanged greetings, but Ace didn't feel like she wanted to do her usual bit and make a new friend, so she took the doctor by the arm, and they went on their way. On Earth, she hadn't been particularly chatty. Okay, so if somebody got introduced to you, you'd talk about music or your new boots or something, but she'd never just gone up to somebody and said hello. Being flung across time and space made you into a real party animal. You could either talk to anybody with food or a job or a squat, or you could be shy and dead. And love got to be like that too. On Earth, Ace had always hoped to meet somebody and have a long, horrible romance. Not tacky, but real. She got a little way with a couple of people, and always had Midge chasing her, the poor dead lad. It was all getting on well cool. Then something huge and raging and brightly colored grabbed her, and a sack full of clothes she'd hidden away for a week out with Julian. It had pulled her through a wall and thrown her across the disk of the Milky Way. She'd watched the disk spin, stars flashing past, until suddenly she was lying on the floor of Sabalom Glitz's spaceship in the Ice World dockyards. Ordinary little girl, a long way from home. But damn, she'd proved she wasn't ordinary. Okay, so she'd taken what warmth she could find on that planet, and it was painful and toddy and sodding meaningless. Ace shook her head and smiled. She'd done it because she wanted to do it. Life had been so odd after meeting the doctor. They'd land somewhere, she'd get a real crush on some flash guy, and they'd always... another grin. Always get the idea. And then, just as she was going to suggest that maybe a day or two in this time zone would be great for her nerves, the doctor would want to move on again. She looked up at him. This time, Ace decided she was going to stick around. Bernice had walked a mile, counting her paces, before setting off back to camp. The grass was moist, and added a spring to her step. In the distance, above the gentle rustling of the grassy autumnal plain, came the sound of horses' hooves. Bernice grinned, and searched in her belt pouch as the riders came into sight. They were racing each other, galloping, and Rocha was, of course, in the lead. Jen was trying to keep up, shouting after her, and Kathleen was laughing his head off, as if shouting could stop a horse. "Hoy!" Benny shouted. "Over here!" Jan glanced up and suddenly spurred his horse towards her, out of the race. Benny closed her eyes, and stood straight and relaxed, one arm out in front of her. In her fist, she clenched a wilted flower. A sudden concussion, a quick leap, and she was riding behind Jan, the flower stuck between his ear. "One day," she muttered, tapping the boy's shoulder, "you are going to get that extremely wrong." "And what'll happen to you then, Professor?" Jan laughed. Benny pretended to consider. "I shall die," she said, "having thrown myself under a horse. That's what you'll tell them I did, anyway. And history's written by the winning side. Take me back to your tent and fill me with mead. Isn't that what we did the night before last?" "Really? I don't remember. You must be right. How are you and Rocha?" Jan was silent for a moment, and Benny hugged him a little closer. Finally, he said, "I think we better try and catch up with her." He whacked the flanks of the horse again, and they angled back towards the other riders. "And no, there will be no mead for you this morning. You have to work." "Well," muttered Benny, "there's a hole in the ground, and I put spades outside my worker's tent. I think they'll understand what I'm getting at for an hour or two at least." The doctor and Ace had wandered to the edge of the small settlement. Beyond the gates of the town, a vast landscape of green downland lay, a rutted dirt track leading off into the distance. The sun was higher now, and the day was becoming a little warmer. "Do you want to hear all about the planet Heaven?" asked the doctor. Yeah, of course I do," frowned Ace. "I'm interested." The doctor smiled, a sad old smile that Ace didn't see often. "Good. Let's stretch our legs." They walked across the grasslands to a small copse that stood atop a hill. As they did so, the doctor told his story. "Heaven is a wonderful world, a glorious place. It has a tiny population for such a colony because it's on the edge of human space." The doctor did a quick pirouette, his finger raised, as if figuring out a direction. Finally, he pointed straight down. "That way lies the Draconian Empire. Not a very liberal empire, that one, eh? Not at all. They don't think females can think. You wouldn't like them. But otherwise, they're quite civilized." "That's cool, then." "The Earth and Draconia were at war for a very short time, but managed to wipe out large numbers of each other. the Daleks were influencing the war. Finally, the two races joined forces against the Daleks. Bad times. Billions of people died. And lots of Daleks, too? Yes, too many. In the end, they started coming up with other schemes. We're at a point where humanity is trying to get on with its neighbours. That's the good thing about Daleks. They make you realise that there's always something worse than what you've got at the moment. And is there anything worse than the Daleks? The doctor stopped for a moment and considered. Oh, yes, he said after a moment. There are much worse things. Ace didn't like the way he said it, so she let the matter drop. So, how do people survive here? Farming, which is heavily subsidized by the Earth corporations. There are special interests here, such as the library and the archaeologists, which brings me to my illustration. They had reached the top of the hill. Ace leaned on a tree and gazed out over the landscape. A vast grassy plain, the sun picking out the occasional river and lake. Mountains rose on the far horizon, their peaks shining silver. But the sun picked out other things, too. Crystal spheres and silver needles, little rings of gleaming metal pyramids, and sculpted tangles of liquid glass. The objects were dotted about the landscape. They must have been buildings. The largest of them would be the size of an office block. The locals, nodded Ace. Smart kit. Not anymore. When the humans and Draconians arrived here, they noticed the architecture. Very well made. Could be millennia old. Everything else is gone. No roads, no books, no survivors. So the Heavenites died out. Happens all the time. Yes, indeed the archaeologists have found roads, and perhaps one day they'll find books. But nobody has ever found a Heavenite body. That's because they were amoebas, or something else blobby. But there are very few remains of any animals of the period. There are native creatures here now, and the ecosystem is changing, with all the Earth and Draconian animals added. But there's no fossil record for any recent era. Time has shut up the book of all this planet's days. Ace recognized something in his tone, something hidden. It was the sound of a hunter, contemplating his prey. She walked between the doctor and the landscape, and looked him in the eye. Is something bad going to happen here? Do you know what? No. His gaze was steady. Ace decided to ask. How long are we staying here? I'm not sure, the Time Lord frowned. I want to find the book. Are you going to explore? Kind of. I just want a bit of time here. Want to stick around for a bit. Is it okay if I wander off? Where are you going? Don't know, Ace lied. Be careful if you're going to meet the Travelers again. They're rough people. Very dangerous. That hurt a bit more than it should have. Ace paused and answered calmly. I'm dangerous too, Professor. That's why I'm here, right? Yeah, I probably will go and see them. Meet you back at the TARDIS. I hope you find what you're looking for. She squeezed his shoulder quickly and set off. This time, the doctor didn't follow Ace. He just stared after her. After a moment, he sighed. You too. Ace ran back to Joycetown. For the exercise, right? It wasn't as if she was used to the doctor respecting her feelings, after all. This was a bit of a treat. Lately, he'd stopped explaining everything. Stopped sighing and showing her that he was hurting too. He was like a sheet of placid water, hardening into ice. At least he didn't know about her fantasies. Well, she hoped he didn't. Still, it would be good if just once. Maybe this time the doctor could face down the Zargoids on his own, or they wouldn't need her. She could just hide in a shelter somewhere with Jan, and come out and congratulate the Time Lord when it was all over. Nice one, Professor. You really showed those Zargoids a thing or two. You don't need me at all. Christ, you don't need me at all. Ace stopped and leaned heavily on the gateway into Joycetown. She remembered Julian, staring into those lights, like a rabbit in the road, and she knew that she wanted to be loved. Standing up again, she walked determinedly into the town. Brother Phaedrus was on his way to the market to buy provisions. He was thinking that he was a good man, that nobody ever understood why good men did bad things. He could be as guilty as you like, but the guilt didn't change what you did. Of course it didn't. All was all. If he did something, it was because he did it. As always, the words of Phaedrus' scriptures soothed him. Ace was as deep in thought as Phaedrus was. They hit each other at full speed around the corner, and Ace fell. Phaedrus helped her up. I'm very sorry. What were you thinking about? Ace blinked at him as she got to her feet. Nothing? Good. Something about the priest's smile disturbed Ace. Hi, you look like you know this place. Where do I find the Travelers? The one who were playing in the market this morning? Well, I do know. Phaedrus stroked his beard thoughtfully. And I will tell you, but first I had better warn you about them. They're a lawless bunch of brigands who would think nothing of stealing everything you own. Please do not approach them. Nah, I'm not planning to approach them. I just need to be able to identify one of them. For the troopers? Yeah, a thin one, craggy face, strange eyes. Phaedrus looked horror-struck. My dear girl, that's Jan Rid, the worst of them all. What has he done to you? Ace looked at her boots and glanced up at the priest coyly. Terrible things, she whispered, her lower lip vibrating with the effort of not laughing. I need to find him so that my brothers can shoot him. She expected a bit of hassle about this, but Phaedrus just grinned. It's not far, he said, if you have the right transport. A wind was rising across the plains of heaven, buffeting the tall grass into strange and luxurious shapes. It was autumn here in the planet's northern hemisphere, and soon there would be snow. Perfect, wonderful snow. Through the grasslands the doctor strode, his hat in his pocket. He was approaching a squat concrete building, a low blockhouse with a dome on the roof. It was surrounded by a mesh fence, and the flashing lights of a helicopter landing pad indicated why no path led to its gate. The man called Kale stood inside the fence, clad in flak armor. He looked up as the figure of the doctor approached, and stepped forward to the fence. A plasma rifle hung from his shoulder. You again, he shouted. What do you want? The doctor didn't answer, and kept walking. Stay where you are, the man yelled. The doctor was nearly up to the fence. Kale snatched his rifle and aimed. Stop, or I fire, he cried out. The doctor stopped. There's a fence between you and me. I'm unarmed, he murmured. Touchy, aren't you? I'll say I'm touchy, snarled the sentry. And you're under arrest, you cocky bastard. I should write a book on that subject, the doctor grinned. Ace had found a horse, or rather she had bought one. A Draconian merchant in a flowing red robe had a chain of the animals for sale. He had only one of his native Shikarshtas, an old beast which would bear him south to Irvingport, where he would board ship. The winter frightened him, he confided in Ace, and he was looking forward to returning to the Draconian settlements near the equator. Ace assumed that she was being ripped off, but she had the cash, and she doubted that the shivering reptilian wanted to haggle. She was sorry for him, too. Maybe he'd end up frozen on some bleak stretch of sand. The horse took her out of Joycetown, and Ace began to feel more relaxed. She had learnt to ride to Adelaide in 1967, trained by a man called Medj. Yeah, she could ride before she could walk. It was a fine horse, a chestnut gelding. It had certainly been born here, swapped in some edgy Draconian deal along the temperate fringes. Eager to run free, it galloped over the downland, its hooves throwing up clods of mud. It was early afternoon before Ace reached the Valley of the White Horse, as Phaedrus had described it. The sun was low in the sky, and a soft gloom was hovering about the forest that lay in the dells. The camp in the valley was made of stiff tents, supported by struts. They formed a circle around a central bonfire, as yet unlit. Around the tents ran a circle of tall stones. Figures could be spotted moving from tent to tent, and the low skirl of music drifted up the valley. Ace found herself sighing. Hell, what was she doing here? What was she after? It had been months since Robin Yedden, months and years and centuries, but Robin Yedden had been good, and very ordinary, and had taught her that nostalgia was worse than death. So why did she miss him? Bernice Summerfield inspected the earthenware cup carefully. Mycenaean influences. Cathline's been swanning up on his potted history. Jan was picking out clumps of soil from the heel of his boot with a blade. Drink up, Benny, he advised. You're more interested in that cup than in the ale. Now that, Benny nodded, neatly sums up my whole nature, which is odd because I am interested in the ale. She took a deep breath, jerked the cup to her lips, and threw back the whole pint. They'd been talking and drinking since the early morning in the communal tent of the camp. Initially, it had been warm mead, but a lunch of hot soup had convinced the two friends that ale would be the drink for the afternoon. Rosha had arrived at one point, and sat leaning on Jan a mite suspiciously. Rosha kept her hair cut short and rough. She and Jan had their troubles, but Benny had taken her suspicion as a good sign. Benny and Jan had talked about the 20th century, and how mythic content tends to seep into historical stories, and about Benny's relentlessness. Gradually, as the ale found them all, the conversation became freer, and Rosha started to add the occasional word. Why are you here? Jan asked Bernice at one point. Is getting pissed in the afternoon any way for a professor to behave? Benny paused and lowered the cup, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Jan ran a hand through his hair and laughed nervously. Well, I was just joking, nothing's meant by it. If I understand what you're saying, said Benny, you mean that my behavior isn't worthy of a real professor, correct? Oh, come on, Benny. I will not come on. Outside! Jan stood up slowly, shaking his head. He plucked a blade from a block of wood and reached into a chest to toss Bernice one, which she caught easily. If you must, he sighed. Rosha swore loudly in pale air, and swung aside the tent flap. Tell me who kills who, she shouted, and stalked off towards Moira's tent. Benny brushed back her hair and exhaled, her breath visible in the cooling afternoon. Kathleen was carrying piles of kindling to the bonfire. Chemical light sources were being ignited inside the tents. Damn it. Pride again. She felt the weight of the blade in her hands, a short saber with a curved tip. She drew it up experimentally to her shoulder. Well balanced, probably homemade. A few of the traveler children were watching her, standing back a little in their fur-lined parkas. When Jan came out of his tent, pulling on a woolen jumper, Benny spread her arms wide. "I think you should kill me," she confessed. "This is an awful idea. My temper again." "Sorry." Jan laughed and swung his sword experimentally. "You're just scared." "No," Benny muttered. "No, I'm not scared. I just don't want to hurt you." Jan wandered forward, scratching his chin. "Well, I don't want to," and he slashed for Benny's stomach. She parried instinctively and hacked straight back, sending a series of blows at Jan's head until he had to retreat. Elegantly, Jan began to swing his blade in a figure of 8, catching Benny's jabs easily. Benny feigned a blow, and tossed her blade from her right hand to her left. In the same second, she slashed straight for Jan's sword hand. Jan's blade spun into the air, and Benny leapt forward, shouldering him onto the ground. The travelers who had gathered to watch clapped and cheered. Benny raised her sword above Jan's head, and then a body slammed into her, sending her sprawling. As she fell, Benny wondered if it was one of the travelers, perhaps Rosha, thinking that she really would have hurt their leader. The two of them rolled over, and Benny's cheek slapped into the cool earth. "Stay there!" Ace growled. Benny had every intention of not moving. Something had caught her eye, inches from her face. Laughing heartily, Jan wandered over and took Ace's hand, pulling her upright. "Welcome," he said. "I'd say you saved my life, except you didn't." "Help me up, won't you?" called Benny from the ground. She still hadn't moved. "And while you're at it, get me a jam jar." Ace frowned at Jan. "Who's she?" Jan looked at his feet again. "That's the professor," he explained. "She's completely insane." The doctor sipped his tea. "This is the best arrest I've suffered in some time," he smiled shyly. "Lovely tea." Operative James Miller leaned back in his chair and adjusted his uniform jacket. He was a gaunt, middle-aged man, the lines of worry etched into his face, but his eyes held a twinkle, and when he spoke, his voice was full of humor. "And you're an interesting prisoner. I must apologize for Kale's behavior. It could have been worse. You could have been handed to my deputy, Hoarth. My crew here are on loan from IMC, and most of them don't know their arse from their elbow. Now then, you told my guards that you're called the Doctor? Doctor who?" "Ah, well, that's the question, isn't it?" Miller appeared to ignore the vagueness of the doctor's reply. "Some of my lot were down the market in Joycetown this morning, probably misbehaving themselves with the travelers. They noticed a big blue box. Is that yours?" "Yes." Miller was smiling like a man who was about to guess the right answer to a charade. "And you know the Draconians quite well, am I right?" The doctor leaned back in his chair and grinned sheepishly. "I'm not often recognized. I've heard stories about you from an old Draconian business partner my father had. He called you Karshtakovar, the oncoming storm. You appear only when there's terrible danger," he said. "Yes. I have a talent for being in the wrong place at the right time. Why were you so keen to get shot this afternoon? I wanted to see how nervous your staff were. Well, lad, you found out. They pick it up from me. You're not happy?" "No. Heaven's a dull spot, but I keep seeing dangers around every corner. Getting paranoid in my old age, I thought. Until you arrived, that is." The doctor leaned forward, appearing suddenly to take Miller into his confidence. "I can't see why Earth has such a military presence here. You have the library to guard, of course." "Huh." Miller stood and began to pace his office, stopping to straighten the reproduction Van Gogh that hung on one wall. "Embarrassing diaries, official records of the lunar penal colony. A couple of security men could do it." The doctor silently took another sip from his cup. "I work for the Directorate of External Ops, Doctor. I answer to Earth Central only. I used to be one of these corporate mercenaries, mind. A Dalek specialist opened me up with its claw, then I opened it up. This is a dead-end planet, a place where things end up, and I'm here with a big squad of Serari men trying to persuade them that I'm actually in charge and not their managers." Miller settled back into his chair. "You may well ask why." The doctor paused and then looked him in the eye. "I am," he smiled. "Then I'd better tell you, hadn't I?" said Miller, smiling back. "More tea?" Bernice and Rocha had been fascinated by whatever it was that Benny had caught, and Ace had been pretty interested too, until Jan took her arm. "Let me show you around the place," he whispered. "Those two will argue over the origins of an insect. They'll be at it for ages." "Yeah, great." Asa walked quickly off with him, and they had scampered through the camp, past the crying babies in their pouches, the many dogs that jumped up and licked Jan's hand, the colorful tents and fluttering washing lines. They headed up onto the downs at the head of the valley. A white horse had been cut out of the chalk, a Celtic etching of something that was wilder than a conventional horse, a bunch of flying lines with a ferocious mouth. The eye was formed out of melted crystal, cemented into the ground. It glinted in the low sun. "We cut this ourselves," Jan sighed, flopping onto the ground inside the horse's body. "You can see the whole camp from here. What's your name?" I'm Ace. Dorothy, if you like. Didn't used to like it here, but I'm getting into it. She'd sat down, at a little distance. I'm Jan Ridd. I have a secret name too, but I'm not brave enough to offer it up, like you offer up Ace. Nah, my real name's the secret one, and I just thought I could tell you it. Do I get to hear yours? Eventually. Jan smiled a knifey smile, and Ace shivered again. She'd found a question to keep the conversation going, because otherwise he'd have just sat there staring until something happened. And something would happen. Where do you lot come from? All over. Most of us were born in the convoy. If you speak Palair, then you must know about us. Not much. Tell me. Jan sighed and brushed his hair back from his forehead. Well now, way back in the 20th century, anarchists and various other people who weren't happy with the way of life in Britain, oh, that was on Earth, they joined up with groups of traveling people who'd been around for centuries. Ace knew it all, but she was, quite quietly, looking at Jan. He had big hands, notched with hard work. His hair was tied back into a ponytail, knotted way down his back. There would be a lot of hair in that. He was muscular, but thin, a boy who'd been active all his life. He wore thick wool and leather, in black and purple. Now, the convoy, as it came to be called, moved around the country, visiting various musical festivals, celebrating the solstices at really ancient megalithic temples. They were pagans too, as we are. What do you worship? The goddess and her followers. I'm into the trickster myself, the god of randomness. Does it worry you? Nah, whatever you want to do. There's a ceremony tonight if you want to stay. God, this guy was quick off the mark. Ace pretended to consider. I don't know. Is there any way I could crash? I'm sure somebody will find you space. We offer hospitality to everyone, even pissheads like the professor. Now, back to the story. Jan slithered up on his knees, looking Ace straight in the eye. He was becoming more animated, obviously excited by the history of his people, and excited by her. Oh yeah. The travelers suffered greatly under the governments of the earth, begging and stealing and living in squats. They sheltered in camps in the winter, and came down to the cities in the summer. Over the centuries, they kept their culture going by oral tradition. The legends, the language, the songs. The first great human expansion into space happened. A traveler called Fox saw that his people could finally be free. They stole a ship that was in dock for repairs, and took it as far into hyperspace as they could. Jan laughed, imagining the scene. His hands were drawing pictures in the air, squeezing meaning out of the cold atmosphere. When Earth ships first met the Arcturians, the Earth ambassador was told that they'd met humans before. Fox and his crew had landed on Arcturus 6, and bussed for their supper. Jan threw his head back and laughed, and Ace saw that he was tattooed, a snake eating its own tail, wrapped around his throat and down into his shirt. Anyhow, the colonies kept on expanding, and the travelers found their places on the fringes, setting up megaliths, scratching a living on the frontier. Then the frontier closed in this direction. It closed on heaven, the world between the protectorates. This place is the real margins, a place where things are sent to be lost if the corporations don't like them, if they're against money. So we're here, because we're against money, and if we don't use it amongst ourselves, we barter where we can. Money malforms a civilization, makes it freaking obscene. We just want to live free, and heaven's one of the last places where we can do it. It's a kind of home, until they come and take it from us again. Ace was impressed. She sat hugging her knees, wondering when she'd get to kiss him. He was just showing off, knowing that he could ask her back to his tent and she'd go. Big head. You the leader of that lot, then? Jan shook his head, aghast. Anarchists don't have leaders. We talk everything over and decide what we all want to do. Does that work? Yes. There are about 30 of us in the camp, including 6 children. Everybody's got a voice, but we try to argue things out rather than vote, accommodate everyone. Christopher is the priest. He makes sure everybody gets heard. Moira is the priestess. She makes sure that what everyone says makes a difference. I've just got a big mouth, so people watch me. Hey, look down there. Bernice was standing in the middle of the tents, waving her arms above her head. She wants us to go back. Ace got up. They must have decided what it is they found. As they walked back down to the camp, Jan seemed to make a decision. Listen, he said, a hint of concern creeping into his voice. I'd like to talk to you a lot, and tell you stories, and, well, listen to you. That uncertainty again. Like suddenly he looked down and wasn't half as brave as he thought he was. Did he know how cool that was? Was that part of his act? What the hell, it worked. Yeah, I'd like that too. But my life's complex. Roche is going to tell you how complex. All I want to say is, listen to my side afterwards, okay? Okay, Ace whispered. Oh great, she thought, trudging towards the tents. The bastard's married. When they got to Jan's tent, everybody was already there. Well, Rocha and the woman Bernice were. The large canopy was full of brightly colored silks and bundles of cloth. Jan explained that he made clothes, sold them for good prices, put the money into the tribe. Ace sat awkwardly on a beanbag, looking between Jan and Rocha. Hell, she thought. Girlfriend at least. And she wasn't sure about Bernice either. She was close enough to Jan to brawl with him, but she seemed almost like a mother, even if she was only 30. Ace liked her instantly, and wanted to get to know her, but no way was she going to let Jan out of her sight at the moment. Bernice was staring at the thing she'd captured in a jam jar, oblivious to the quiet conflict happening in the tent. She shared out some more of Jan's mead, and explained in a whisper to Ace that Rosha was getting annoyed about them sitting up on the white horse, so she thought that they should call them out in the cold. She didn't mention Ace's rugby tackle, but the look in her eyes suggested that she was amused. Jan sat in the center of the tent, at an equal distance between the three women, and from the way his gaze hopped back and forth, Ace could see that he was almost enjoying the situation. "You can't just let tension eat away at you," he explained. "I'm glad that Benny and I fought. I think you have to fight if you want to, like you have to do whatever else you feel." Rosha frowned. "There are tensions you don't talk about, you quinch wretch." She looked up at Ace. "We're together, if you were wondering. We've got a contract, bound on the great wheel it was." She ruffled Jan's hair, and Ace made herself smile indulgently. "I have another friend, so Jan can spread his seat as far as he likes so far as it comes back to me. The thing is, he knows that any time he wants to be with me, properly and forever, all he has to do is say so." Ace looked down at the thick rug on the floor, following its complex Celtic knotworks. She couldn't look Rosha in the eye. Was it that obvious? Had Jan said something to Rosha? Oh God, why did she get involved in things like this? Bernice had heard the nervous silence and spoke. "I wouldn't have hurt Jan, you know, but there are certain things that I'm touchy about. Now," she offered the jar to Rosha. "I've had a look. What do you think of this?" The woman made to unscrew the jar, but Benny stopped her. "No, I don't know what it is. That's why I use tweezers." Ace was surprised at how much this professor reminded her of the doctor. She was a real expert, even though she still seemed slightly pissed. Rosha stared in at the thing in the jar. It was a tiny white filament, like a couple of strands of dog hair. "Our Lizzie dog's been shedding again," she sighed. "So what?" The thing in the jar twitched. Rosha put the jar down. "I thought I knew every plant and animal in heaven," she murmured. "I'm the herb cutter for the tribe. Can I check it against my books?" "Of course," Bernice said, "but I want it afterwards." Jan had turned his head in Ace's direction and was looking at her, rather than at the jar, staring. Ace forced herself to meet his gaze. They looked at each other for a full minute. God, why did he have to be so blatant? He was so sure of himself, so confident, and he had a sell-by date of his own, which was good. She wouldn't be here forever. It was a second before Ace realized that Bernice was looking at her too. The scientist had winked, almost imperceptibly, and Ace suppressed a laugh. Rosha was still staring at the jar. Poor woman. Damn it, her life was going to get so much worse. Ace frowned when she realized how hard she was having to try to be sympathetic. "I need to get back to my dig," Benny sighed, standing up. "Anybody fancy walking back with me?" Ace looked once more at Jan, and then back to Benny. The man looked far too expectant. "You can't always get what you want." "You're on," Ace grinned, and picked up her backpack. The look on Jan's face was wonderful. "Will you be back for the ceremony tonight?" he asked, like a kicked puppy. "We're going to the Great Wheel." "Oh, I don't know." Ace smiled maliciously. "Let's see how tired I am, eh?" "You're very interesting," Benny said as they wandered out into the dusk, Ace leading the horse behind her. "Cheers. Mainly because of the badges on your jacket. Those are really odd, because they're all from one of the eras I specialize in, early space age. They must have cost you a fortune." "Nah," Ace grinned. "I'm a time traveler from the 1980s. Benny giggled in a surprisingly girlish way. "That is less possible than something very impossible indeed. That is really cracking impossible. Lots of people do it. Even Daleks have time travel." "Do they? Do they really?" Ace caught the slight hint of something lost in Benny's voice. She suddenly felt the need to be serious. She stopped walking. "It's true. I used to live in Perivale, London. Ask me anything you like." So, Benny asked her about the design of tube trains, the Italia 90 England squad, and the destruction of Blackpool Tower. "That must have happened after I left," Ace said. "No, it didn't. I was trying to bluff you. Either you're as expert as I am, or you're telling the truth. Well, bang at me, old cocksparrer." "You what?" "Aha! You don't recognize the speech patterns of the time." "Yes, I do. That was nothing like the way we used to talk. Where did you—" Ace realized that Benny was laughing again. "Oh, right. I believe you." Bernice smiled, patting the younger woman's shoulder. "You move like you're telling the truth, all relaxed. No tension about the shoulders. And you've been looking at me all the time." Ace groaned. "Oh, no, you're one of these body language people." "Quite a bit. Sorry. I won't do it to you again. God, I hate it. It isn't just that, though. I'm a bit like Jan in some ways. When magic comes along, we ought to just accept it. If you were also into Martian culture and body language, I'd think you were some sort of gift from above. How did you get here?" "I travelled in a police box." "How baroque of you. The bloke who owns it is into the whole bit. The doctor. He might be able to tell you how it all works." Ace decided to ask her a question. "Have you and Jan ever—" Bernice looked up at the sky ruefully. An ocean of stars was starting to appear in the deep blue. "Well, we tried, but I'm not really built for that sort of relationship, and we decided it was a bad idea, and why we didn't have more meat instead. I've only ever had 3 boyfriends, and— I'm sorry, what's your name?" "Ace," said Ace, extending her hand. "It suits you. I'm Professor Bernice Summerfield. Benny, if you want." They walked on for a while in silence. Then Benny suddenly said, "He's not a very safe man to be around, and he's my friend, but so is Rosha, and maybe... well, no, whatever." Ace smiled. "I'm after danger. I don't want to hurt Rosha, but I'm here for the weekend, okay?" "Okay, now that is the right idiom. Jan uses it all the time, but then he's obsessed with your time as well. Oh, look, here's Christopher." The tall being was looking up into the sky, his robes dark against the greeny grey of the hillside. Ace looked at Benny questioningly. "Is he a bloke, then?" "He's neither. He and Jan were in the military together. There were some experiments done. Christopher's given up his gender in favour of mental powers. I think that's a good deal. Sometimes." "I don't," Ace shivered. "Hey, is Jan, despite the efforts of 100 angry husbands?" "Yes, he is." "Ahoy, Christopher! What are you looking for?" "Hush!" the voice boomed back. The two women and the horse drew level with the gaunt figure. Ace noticed that, now the hood of his robe was down, Christopher's scalp was covered in delicate tattoos. They decorated an ugly plug which jutted from the base of his skull. With a jolt of distaste, Ace realized what it was. A jack plug, like you might find on the back of a video recorder. Christopher was looking up at a particular point in the sky, his eyes narrowing. "I am looking into space," he whispered. "I was preparing for the ceremony tonight. Then I noticed. There is something out there, just beyond my sight. Something evil. We have been warned on the wheel about some danger. If I could only see it..." His voice took on a pained tone. "Then I could spare us all such suffering." Oh. At the point where Christopher had been staring, 1,000 shooting stars suddenly burst across the sky. Meteor trails whizzed outwards in a burst of light. After a few seconds, they had all faded away. "That was great!" grinned Ace. "What was it?" "Death," said Christopher. 3 entry trails are made by pods ejected from a spacecraft. They each contain 1 or 2 dead humans, soldiers, colonists, people who lost their lives in this area of space. "But why here?" "You are new here, aren't you?" Benny smiled. "That's what heaven is for, Ace. This is Club Dead. The Earth and Draconian peoples designated heaven as a graveyard world. It's been declared sacred ground by every religion of both races. The place is kept lovely, and billions of corpses keep the ecosystem flourishing. It's one gigantic graveyard." "Great," said Ace. "Planet of the corpses." Christopher turned to her, his eyes glowing slightly in the dusk. "And there will be more," he whispered. "There will be many more."